Hey, what's up, biology students? Welcome to the virtual lecture on cellular respiration and fermentation, part 1. If you recall from our last video, we talked a lot about a special molecule called ATP, which powers all of the energy-demanding activities of cells. All cells on the planet, including the trillions of cells that make up your body. In this video, we're going to begin to understand the process by which food and the energy stored within food is released and converted into ATP. The name of that process is cellular respiration. So here I have a question for you. It says, how do we convert food into an energy requiring activity, like for instance, movement? Then I give you a picture of sushi representing our food. Then I give you a picture of a beach volleyball player, in this case Karch Karai, diving for a ball, representing movement. So we're going to come back to this because I want you to always keep in mind the overall goal. The overall goal of this whole process of cellular respiration is to make ATP. So in a very simple sense, so we can do things, so we can move, so we can build, and so we can do active transport. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to write out the summary equation for this entire process. So even though it's not a one-step chemical reaction, we can summarize it as such. We can say we go in with X and we come out with Y. So what do we go in with? What do we start with? What are the reactants? Well, the first is an example of digested food, a small biomolecule called glucose. Now I'm going to write out the name glucose. I'm also going to include the chemical structural formula, which would be C6H12O6. So those both mean the same thing. That is glucose. Now we're going to break down glucose in the presence of oxygen, which is a gas that we acquire from the atmosphere, thanks to the many little algae in the oceans and lakes and rivers and estuaries, and the plants and the terrestrial environments that are undergoing photosynthesis and constantly releasing this oxygen, which allows us to break down our food. So that's our oxygen. The reason we put a 6 in front of it is just to be correct in a chemical or chemistry sense. We have to balance our equation, showing that whenever you do a chemical reaction, matter cannot be created or destroyed. So if you come in with 6 carbons, you have to come out with 6 carbons. You can rearrange things, you can form bonds or break bonds, but you can't create or destroy energy or matter. So once we've broken down our glucose in the presence of oxygen, we're going to get a waste product, which is basically the remnant of our food, the remnant of our glucose that no longer has any energy to extract from it. We have a name for that. You've probably heard of it. You're exhaling it right now. It's called carbon dioxide, CO2. It's a waste product. There's no energy left in this molecule. The only thing it can do to us is harm us, because if it sits around in your blood for too long, it acidifies your blood. So we have to make sure to exhale it via our lungs into the atmosphere. Then we also produce another molecule, which you're definitely familiar with, which is water. Sort of interesting. Water is a byproduct of breaking down food. Not much of it, so that's not enough water to survive on at all. You can't just eat and live off of the water that you produce by eating, but it is important to note that we do produce water. But in a sense, these are both waste products, because the reason we're doing this whole process, remember, is to release energy from food, in this case glucose, and to harness and store that energy into many molecules of ATP, as we're going to learn in the next 2 videos. 32 molecules of ATP on average. And that is why we undergo cellular respiration. So I'm going to underline this because it's so important. Another important product of this metabolic pathway, if you will, is heat. As we break down food, we are going to release heat. And that is not a waste product, because, especially for us as mammals, as warm-blooded endotherms, we use a lot of that heat that we generate via our metabolism to maintain a constant, warm, internal body temperature. But this equation here summarizes cellular respiration. I really wish it was as simple as saying, okay, we're just going to mix glucose and oxygen together and then just magically pump out CO2, ATP, and water. Unfortunately, there's 5 stages to go from point A to point B. They all have names. Even within each of those 5 stages, there's sometimes upwards of 10, 12 steps. You know, we're going to summarize it the best we can for a general biology class. But I do want you to realize that this is an important subject. Like, if you are a biology major at any 4-year university, or even any type of bio major, or even chemistry major, you're probably going to take a class called metabolic biochemistry, which would be a whole semester or a whole quarter solely devoted to this process right here. So you can get really deep into it. There's a lot of chemistry, a lot of organic chemistry, a lot of cellular biology. But again, we're in a general bio class, so we care more about the big picture ideas, especially where things are happening, why they're happening from the perspective of the organism that's doing this, things like that, as opposed to numbers of certain molecules. You do need to know both, but I value more the big picture. So that's our summary. Moving on. Now, as I go through the next slides, these are going to be in reference to a picture that you are already familiar with from our previous video. So this is somewhat of a review, and that is to better understand the process by which a heterotroph, like yourself, an organism that has to consume, aka eat food, to sustain itself, to power its activities. How does such an organism go from food to ATP? Now, like we said, cellular respiration is a big portion of this, and it involves breaking down small food molecules like glucose. But there are other steps in order to get from food to glucose. So these are it's the introduction to cellular respiration. Okay? Because cellular respiration is not the breakdown of food. It's the breakdown of small, digested food molecules. Okay, so we're going to start here and work our way here. So the first step is to digest your food. You must realize that food, as you can see in this picture, is comprised of huge biomolecules. Really big fats, really long polysaccharides, really long proteins. And these molecules hold a tremendous amount of chemical energy. Remember our analogy from the previous video? We used dollar bills. Currency is an analogy where currency in this case represents energy. Well, if we were to represent the energy of food as money, it would represent like $10 million of energy. And we said the whole goal of this process is to generate a form of energy that are really tiny, I guess you could say, what's the word for it? Not frugal, but someone that doesn't require much in their life. There's a word, I just can't think of it. A cell, a tiny cell. So the cell is going to be doing transactions where it only needs, a $10 bill, a $20 bill. The word I was looking for was minimal. Okay, so this cell has a really minimal lifestyle. So it doesn't need a ton of energy because it's so tiny. So food in itself, that's way too much energy for the little cells that make up your body. Okay, so we need to break down that $10 million bill somehow into $20 bills or $10 bills. And the first step in doing that is to digest your food within your digestive system. Your esophagus, your mouth, your stomach, your small intestine, and your large intestine, using the help of your liver and your pancreas and your gallbladder. So, in summary, we have to break down these big molecules into their smaller parts. We have to break down polysaccharides into monosaccharides. We have to break down proteins into amino acids. We have to break down fats into fatty acids and glycerol. This is not cellular respiration, but it is a necessary event that must precede cellular respiration. To give you a better idea of what I'm talking about here, if you're not familiar with your own digestive system, we're going to take a moment to watch a 4-minute video that summarizes the digestive system. And let's start that.
Across the whole planet, humans eat on average between 1 and 2.7 kilograms of food a day. That's over 365 kilograms a year per person, and more than 28,800 kilograms over the course of a lifetime. And every last scrap makes its way through the digestive system. Comprised of 10 organs, covering 9 meters, and containing over 20 specialized cell types, this is one of the most diverse and complicated systems in the human body. Its parts continuously work in unison to fulfill a singular task, transforming the raw materials of your food into the nutrients and energy that keep you alive. Spanning the entire length of your torso, the digestive system has 4 main components. First, there's the gastrointestinal tract, a twisting channel that transports your food and has an internal surface area of between 30 and 40 square meters, enough to cover half a badminton court. Second, there's the pancreas, gallbladder, and liver, a trio of organs that break down food using an array of special juices. Third, the body's enzymes, hormones, nerves, and blood all work together to break down food, modulate the digestive process, and deliver its final products. Finally, there's the mesentery, a large stretch of tissue that supports and positions all your digestive organs in the abdomen, enabling them to do their jobs. The digestive process begins before food even hits your tongue. Anticipating a tasty morsel, glands in your mouth start to pump out saliva. We produce about 1.5 liters of this liquid each day. Once inside your mouth, chewing combines with the sloshing saliva to turn food into a moist lump called the bolus. Enzymes present in the saliva break down any starch. Then your food finds itself at the rim of a 25 centimeter long tube called the esophagus, down which it must plunge to reach the stomach. Nerves in the surrounding esophageal tissue sense the bolus's presence and trigger peristalsis, a series of defined muscular contractions. That propels the food into the stomach, where it's left at the mercy of the muscular stomach walls, which pound the bolus, breaking it into chunks. Hormones secreted by cells in the lining trigger the release of acids and enzyme-rich juices from the stomach wall that start to dissolve the food and break down its proteins. These hormones also alert the pancreas, liver, and gallbladder to produce digestive juices and transfer bile a yellowish-green liquid that digests fat, in preparation for the next stage. After 3 hours inside the stomach, the once shapely bolus is now a frothy liquid called chyme, and it's ready to move into the small intestine. The liver sends bile to the gallbladder, which secretes it into the first portion of the small intestine, called the duodenum. Here, it dissolves the fats floating in the slurry of chyme so they can be easily digested by the pancreatic and intestinal juices that have leached onto the scene. These enzyme-rich juices break the fat molecules down into fatty acids and glycerol for easier absorption into the body. The enzymes also carry out the final deconstruction of proteins into amino acids and carbohydrates into glucose.
So those last 15 seconds are really the most important part of this video. Basically, what's going on in the small intestine. This is where you're breaking down the large molecules of your food into their smaller parts, aka the monomers. So with the exception of your saliva, where you start to break down starch into glucose, and the stomach, where you start to break down proteins into amino acids, most of your enzymatic digestion occurs in the small intestine. It's here that you break down a huge variety of fats into fatty acids and glycerol, polysaccharides into monosaccharides, and proteins into amino acids. So that really summarizes the main events that are occurring. The pancreas, even though it wasn't really highlighted much in this video, is the most important accessory organ. It produces dozens of different enzymes that allow you to break down fats, proteins, and polysaccharides in your small intestine. Next, here in the last 10 or 15 seconds, we're going to track where these small digested molecules, monosaccharides, amino acids, fatty acids, and so on, where do they go?
This happens in the small intestine's lower regions, the jejunum and ileum, which are coated in millions of tiny projections called villi. These create a huge surface area to maximize molecule absorption and transference into the bloodstream. The blood takes them on the final leg of their journey to feed the body's organs and tissues.
So that's it. The answer is these small digested biomolecules first get absorbed by the cells that line your small intestine. They're called small intestinal epithelial cells. And then they are soon transferred into your bloodstream, where, like the video just said, these small digested food molecules can fuel all of your tissues from head to toe. Primarily, though, those that require the most energy, things like your muscles, your heart, and your brain. But all cells require energy to some extent. So that, what I just said, summarizes step 2. You have to then absorb, we can call them nutrients if you want, so I don't have to say small digested biomolecules, I'm going to say nutrients. And specifically, in this unit, we're going to focus just on one of these small nutrients, that being glucose. So I don't have to say this tongue twister, I'll try to use that instead. Step 3, which is going on at the same time, is for your body to access our other reactant. So we have one half of the equation down. We have our glucose. We just transported it to the blood and then transported it to our cells so they can undergo cellular respiration, but we still need oxygen. As you probably know, it is our lungs that help us inhale oxygen. Your lungs then transfer that oxygen to your bloodstream. It is carried within your red blood cells, specifically by a protein called hemoglobin. And then that oxygen is also dispersed to all the cells of your body from head to toe so that they can undergo cellular respiration. So that's great. We have our two reactants. We have oxygen, we have glucose. So that's what is meant by steps 3A and 3B. Also, I want to note that you use that same system, your circulatory system and your respiratory system, to exhale CO2, which moves in the reverse direction, is oxygen. And I also want to point out that the term respiration alone refers to breathing, gas exchange. Cellular respiration is completely different. Cellular respiration is the process by which we break down molecules like glucose within an individual cell to generate ATP. Very different from the inhaling and exhaling of oxygen and CO2, which is respiration. So do note that difference. And then I had a little blurb at the bottom that said to go back to this diagram and point out some of the things that I've added. And I actually already referred to them. I just gave you examples of digestion. This really nicely summarizes all of your digestion. And then I added in step 2.5 to say that, well, after you enzymatically digest your food, you subsequently have to absorb those molecules like glucose into your intestinal cells and into your red blood cells so that they can be transported to all the different cells throughout your body. That's why I have a picture of a red blood cell and an intestinal cell on the left. Which leaves us, finally, here with I'm going to say it one more time, a small digested biomolecule, a nutrient, like glucose. And now it is our job to understand how we further break down glucose and release its energy to produce ATP. And it's this process here that is referred to as cellular respiration. And again, this occurs within your cells. Not only your cells, it's not a human thing, it's not an animal thing. This is a process that occurs inside all eukaryotic cells, whether you're a plant, an animal, a fungus, or a protist. So that's where we're at. Step 4, and again, step 4 is the primary focus of the next 2 videos. Here again is your summary equation. And again, the reason I went through the last 10 or so slides is because what drives me crazy is if I teach this complex process of cellular respiration, which all general biology classes do or have to do. I hate when I teach it, but then someone confuses simple things like digestion or breathing with cellular respiration. Okay, so I want you to understand how this process fits into your entire body, fits into your everyday life, how it relates to breathing, but it's different. Breathing, for instance, allows you to access oxygen so you can do this process. You digest your food so you can access the glucose to do this process. So again, these are what I call the big picture ideas, and that's what I want you to take away mostly from this, okay? So I think it's wrong to try to teach this without giving you a proper discussion about the basics of the digestive system and the basics of the circulatory system. So depending on which class of mine you're in, I either have a lab or a worksheet that you'll soon be seeing or are currently seeing, which is devoted to better understanding the digestive system. Because it's a necessary event that has to occur before cellular respiration. All right, so now we're ready to jump into cellular respiration itself. So we have this diagram that we're going to refer to many times in this video. I call it my cellular respiration diagram. And the first thing that we want to do in this picture is label our reactants. Label glucose, understand how I depict it in my drawings, and also label oxygen. And then label a few structures within the cell while we're at it. So here we go. Here's that picture I was referring to. We're going to start by labeling major areas or structures within the cell. So obviously we're not looking at the entire cell right now, just a little snapshot of it, a little portion. But in black here, the top, this represents the outer barrier of the cell, called the cell membrane. So everything that we're talking about with respect to cellular respiration is occurring inside the cell. Remember that the region within a cell, but outside of the organelles, is referred to as the cytoplasm. So I can highlight that for you. This space would be the cytoplasm. That's important to note because stage 1 of this entire process will be occurring in the cytoplasm. And now we're ready to label our reactants, glucose and oxygen. So I have a little legend or a little key here at the bottom left. So this is what glucose looks like. It really does sort of look like that in reality. It has 6 carbons, each indicated by a point on the shape. And the other molecule we want to label is oxygen, which I've just drawn as a blue circle. And I want to note that when you breathe in oxygen, it diffuses from the atmosphere, from high to low, into your lungs, into your blood, into the many cells of your body. Then it diffuses inside a very special organelle called the mitochondria. And it's able to do so because there's less oxygen outside your cell than in. There's less oxygen inside the mitochondria than the cytoplasm, so it's able to use diffusion to move. And it does so without any expenditure of energy. And my main point of all of this is most of that oxygen that you breathe in ends up right here in the innermost compartment of the mitochondria, which we will give a name in a bit. I also want to take the time up here to label glucose. And as I show you the breakdown of glucose, I'm going to depict glucose in 2 different ways, but they both represent the same thing. Your book uses a cartoon depiction sort of like this, 6 circles to represent glucose, each circle representing a carbon. So these 2 things mean the same thing. So this is glucose, and so is this. I'll refer to both at the same time. Okay, and then if you look at this slide, it says, there's a step 5. That's assuming you finished cellular respiration and you completely broke down your glucose and you got a ton of ATP, 32 of it to be exact. You could then use that ATP to do an energy-demanding activity, like, for instance, diving for a volleyball, movement, muscle contraction. Okay? But we have quite a ways to go from step 4 to step 5. Moving forward, we're going to ask, again, what I call my big picture questions, which are important. Big picture questions with respect to cellular respiration as a whole. Our first question is, what types of organisms do cellular respiration? It's a very broad, simple answer, and that is all eukaryotic organisms. The entire animal kingdom and all the cells that make up those organisms, all plants, all funguses like yeasts and mushrooms, and all single-cell protists and seaweed as well. Or you could just say, in a simple sense, all eukaryotic organisms. Question number 2. Where does this process occur within a eukaryotic cell? Well, as we're going to learn, the majority of the process occurs within an organelle called the mitochondria, but about 20% of the process, specifically stage number 1, occurs in the cytoplasm. So we're going to say both in the mitochondria and the cytoplasm. Question number 3. What is the primary goal of cellular respiration? Why do we do it? The answer has to do with energy. Has to do with releasing energy from food to generate ATP to power all of our cells. You can't do anything without ATP. You can't grow, you can't develop, you can't communicate, you can't move. Everything shuts down without a form of energy. So this is a constant process happening throughout your entire life. You're producing millions of ATPs per second per cell, and you're comprised of trillions of cells. So it's a fundamental, constant characteristic of a living thing. Next question. Is this process of cellular respiration considered to be aerobic or anaerobic? I guess our first question is, what do those terms mean? Well, aerobic means occurring in the presence of oxygen, while anaerobic means the opposite, in the absence of oxygen. So if you remember back to our summary equation, one of the necessary reactants for this entire process is oxygen itself. So therefore, cellular respiration is an aerobic metabolic process. It requires oxygen to occur. It is the reason that you are constantly breathing. It's the reason you have a heart, it's the reason you have lungs. To inhale and transport the reactants that help you produce ATP. This slide here is just describing cellular respiration as a whole. We can say that throughout this entire process of breaking down food like glucose, we're going to be releasing energy during this process. A general rule of thumb in biology is that when you break down a molecule into smaller parts, you generally release energy when you do so. And conversely, when you are building a bigger molecule, that generally requires an input of energy. So since here in cellular respiration we're breaking down food, we are releasing the energy of that food. We have a special name to refer to that, and that term is exergonic, which is just a fancy term for energy releasing process. So cellular respiration is an exergonic, energy releasing reaction or metabolic process. And we're not going to waste that amount of energy that is released. Cells are really good at storing a large portion of that energy as ATP. Here's another look at the summary equation of cellular respiration. And I want you to start to understand that cellular respiration is largely a series of consecutive electron transfers. We are going to strip away or rip electrons off of glucose. We're going to break bonds on glucose and strip away its electrons. And those electrons that get removed are ultimately going to get transferred to oxygen. Okay, so if we summarize the whole process of cellular respiration, it can be summarized as such. Ripping off pairs of electrons from glucose from food and transferring those electrons to oxygen. Now, we will understand in the next video why we do that. Like, why on earth would you want to strip away electrons from food and give them to oxygen? What's the point of that? How does that help us make ATP? Well, the why portion of that will become more clear in the next video. Let's see. I think I've said everything here. Next, this is meant to help you, give you another analogy for cellular respiration as a whole, to relate it to everyday life. Because again, these are things that are, you can't visualize it. You can't even see a cell with your naked eye, let alone the molecules that are doing metabolic chemical reactions, right? It's something you can't partake in. It's something that you can't relate to directly. So it can be hard to understand in that sense. So I'm going to give you a bigger analogy, which is really truly the same thing happening in cellular respiration, but something that you're more familiar with in your everyday life. But it is not testable material. It's just to help you understand. So that's why you see the asterisk at the top. And my analogy to cellular respiration is the combustion of gasoline that occurs in the engine of your car whenever you drive, or the engine of an airplane. Okay? Strikingly similar processes. So we're going to talk about how they're similar. So let's take a look at what goes on in your car. First off, you have to go to the gas station, right? And you have to fill your car with gasoline. What is gasoline? Well, gasoline is primarily food, in a sense. It's a molecule called octane. That's the primary component of gasoline. This is what it looks like. Let's see if I can fit it in there. 8 carbons completely surrounded by hydrogens. I'm not going to fill in all the hydrogens, but if you imagine that I just keep doing this, that's what octane looks like. Very similar to a fat. Okay, it's a biomolecule that is obviously derived from oil, that is basically the remnants of ancient organisms that have died on Earth, that have been compressed under layers of sediment. They've become really hot, really compressed, really pressurized. And when you die, your biomolecules, your fats, your carbs, all that, your proteins get compressed into fuels like this. So we're really running our cars on the remains of ancient organisms. That's where natural gas comes from, that comes out of your stove. That's where coal comes from. That's where oil comes from, right? You have to pump deep in the ground to get it. That's why. So think of gasoline, because it really is. It's a biomolecule. It's basically like food. And in your car, in the engine, we break down that food. Very similar to the way that we break down food inside a cell and inside the mitochondria. There is one key difference, though. A car is not as efficient as a cell. A car is not going to intricately extract electrons and energy from gasoline step by step. It's just going to combust it and release all of its energy at once. So what happens is you have an intake valve which takes in oxygen. You have your octane, your gasoline. You compress it for high pressure. And then lastly, you spark it with a flame. And you basically explode the food. You explode the octane. It's called combustion. And all the electrons from your octane get removed and stripped away. And they all get transferred directly to oxygen. You release a tremendous amount of energy and heat and motion. That motion and energy thrusts down the, can't think of its name, but what it does is that force turns your wheels, okay? It's converted into mechanical energy. A lot of heat is given off. If you didn't have a muffler, you would hear that explosion. It would be really loud. Think of a motorcycle. It doesn't have a muffler, but that same sound that you hear from a motorcycle is occurring when you're driving. It's just muted so you can't hear it, so it's not so obnoxious. Same thing. Then the remnants of that octane are CO2 and water and heat, and those are, I guess you could say, exhaled from your car through the exhaust pipe. Those are the same things that you exhale through your mouth. Okay? So really the only two differences between what goes on in your engine of your car and within your cells, the mitochondria, is two things. First, an engine breaks down octane in one step. It just explodes it and releases all the energy at once. Whereas your cells, we don't want to explode glucose. We don't want to explode fats. That would be kind of crazy. It'd be too much heat, too much energy. It'd just be chaotic. It'd be like a fireworks show going on in your cell. We want to slowly burn our food and extract energy. In doing so, we're going to be more efficient at the energy that we can extract. 10% more efficient than a car. Second difference is obviously the fuel that we're breaking down. Do not go eat gasoline, even though I call it a food molecule. Our fuels are fats and carbohydrates like glucose and proteins, whereas the fuel for a car is octane. That is not to say that you couldn't run an engine on carbohydrates or fats. I believe one of the first engines of an automobile in the early 1900s was run on peanut oil, which is a fat. It just so happens that octane is readily abundant. I guess I wouldn't say that. It's actually pretty hard to access. It's good for the engine. It lubricates it well, and it's just like the perfect molecule for an engine. But all food is fuel. So hopefully you appreciate these striking similarities between yourselves and engines, because they really are doing the same process. But again, you do it more slowly, and you're way more efficient than a car. All right, so we're finally ready to jump into the 5 individual stages that make up cellular respiration. There are 5 of them. They are largely consecutive, so it goes glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain, the ETC for short, and lastly, chemiosmosis. We're going to work our way through step by step.